Welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast, where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole. And Randy. Hi, Cole.
Hi, Randy. Interesting to have you on this side of the microphone. Usually you're on the listening end.
I think I hit record. It should be working, but we'll check later if it actually worked. But we've got a lot of stuff going on these days. You're working on a new book.
Book number 5, the next adult one.
Next adult book. We've got kids in swimming, all 3 of them. We've got kids in ballet.
And 6th grade and 5th grade and 3rd grade.
So we've got juggling that. I'm continuing to advise a number of different companies. So we have a lot of things going on. And I thought it'd be interesting to just talk about and share some of the tips, techniques, things we're doing, maybe areas we're struggling to talk about best time management. I know when we do workshops, attendees often talk about, where do I find the time for this? And they're talking about just doing their data visualizations. Like, where do you fit in doing your makeovers in the midst of life and everything else around that? So maybe today we can talk about some of the techniques, because I must say one of your best skills is your ability to really be focused and to get things done. And I have some different styles and ways that I do it, and I think I can share some of my things. But what works for you in terms of being able to get in that not only headspace, but get into that moment of flow and getting things done amidst all the other things that we had already talked about?
I think for me, so I have a list, and I know you keep a list as well, which we can talk about. Mine, I don't tend to update super often. So it's an ongoing to-do list where I have different buckets of things. For example, right now, my main 3 areas of focus are the book that we're working on, that I'm writing together with Mike and Alex from the team. We are in intense editing mode up against some tight deadlines right now. So that's one bucket of things. Then I have things related to the podcasts are a priority. We're revamping the podcast page, trying out some new content and styles, which feels very meta to be talking about here. And then the 3rd bucket is Daphne. And I'm still doing a lot of school visits to help spread awareness of graphing superpowers amongst the kindergarten through 4th or 5th grade crowd. And then I have all of the miscellaneous to-dos that come up. And while I have my master list, I know what my priorities are for the quarter, which we can maybe come back to that as well. One of the things that I do to make sure I feel productive every day is have 1 or 2 bigger things that I know I want to get done. And so I can get into those pretty deeply, pretty quickly, and have the luxury of not a lot of interruptions during the day, which I think helps get into that flow you were talking about.
I've seen you have Post-it notes, you have your notebook. What's your very tactical way of keeping track of not only the 3 buckets, but then all the miscellaneous that you talked about?
Well, Post-it notes for me come and go in terms, they're always there. I use them for a ton of things. But for me, a Post-it is something, if I'm about to run to a meeting and there's something I don't want to forget, I write it on the Post-it and put it on my keyboard or somewhere on my desk where I'm going to see it right when I get back. Or if I have an idea and it needs a home, but I haven't figured out where that is yet. So for me, I use Post-its for the don't forget to do this, or don't forget to put this somewhere you're going to see it. Or sometimes I'll enter things into my calendar so that I don't forget them, or send myself an email. I do a lot of sending myself emails that just in the subject line have the thing so that I don't forget. But that's probably one thing, is I don't stop and do the other thing. I'll jot a quick note instead so that it's not interrupting what I'm in the middle of at the moment. But for me, the list is the thing that I come back to. And it's just low tech on a nice pad of paper that actually Elizabeth got me a couple years ago. On the topic of lists, though, I know you have your one-pager, which you've got more of a structure around that maybe than how I approach my list. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, the one sheet, which I call, the one-pager fine too, but I've had this since I started my career. I remember being introduced to it by Todd Zangrillo, HR guy that I'd worked for really early in my career. And I saw he'd always carry around this portfolio, and he'd have this sheet, and I've done some variations on it, which every day I recreate this sheet, and I do it on paper originally up until you recently got me this nice, remarkable electronic tablet, which is able to do the same thing. But my one sheet framework is the same every time.
And as Randy's talking, he's actually pulling this up on his Remarkable.
So this is the template. So imagine a piece of paper, and at the top, upper left corner and the upper right corner, there are two headlines. The upper left is today, meaning today. And then the upper right is week. So this has to do with things that may have to get done that day.
And you rewrite yours every day?
Every day. I think there's something really important around the idea of crossing things out, seeing what's not been crossed out for the day, and then rewriting them the next day, because it does two things. One, it reminds you what didn't get done. But two, if you continue to rewrite the same things day after day, at some point you either get so mad at yourself that you just get it done, or you realize this may not be something that you actually want to get done. So the upper left corner is today, the upper right corner is week. Now let's jump down to the bottom, because I have these divided up into three headlines at the lower portion of the page, which is the first one's storytelling with data. So this is everything that I need to do that falls in the category of storytelling with data. Maybe it's something podcast related, maybe it's something we're doing with Daphne. Then the middle bucket is actually you. I have one, as you can see, it says Cole.
Oh, it does.
So this is because as a married couple with a family, with a business, I have things that come up, and I know your style, which maybe it'll be for another podcast. But the most important thing I can do is bucket together the things I need to bring to you. Oh, yeah, we need to make sure we schedule a dentist appointment, or we have to talk about the podcast format or something. So I have a whole bucket of things for you. And then my third bucket is advisory things. So as things come up, or I think about them, or I'm in a meeting and I take a note, it goes in that bucket of advisory to talk about it. And then the middle section is often varied based on things that are going on. So we were doing some renovation work with our vacation home and such. So there was a whole bucket for that of things that needed to get done. And that was in one bucket. And the other side is tasks that have to get done around the house. So it's almost like the to-do list of tasks and such in the house. And every day this list gets rewritten, ideally the night before.
As I was going to ask, do you have a ritual about when and how you do this?
I usually try to rewrite the list either first thing in the morning when I look at the previous days and look what things made it and didn't make it. Or if I'm really savvy, I do it the night before to make a head start to the day and get the most things done right away.
When you have, I'm just thinking, because I don't write mine nearly that often. I do mine maybe once a week, but sometimes several weeks will go by. And I think it's because a lot of my work is bigger projects. So I'm curious, when you're writing your list every day, are you literally breaking things down that you're going to get done that day across all of the projects? Because otherwise you're writing down a lot of things that aren't going to change every time.
Well, there's very tactical today things, and then there's also strategic things, ongoing projects. I do keep those on there, but think of the today section as a section where if I go to bed that night not getting the things off of that list, it wasn't a great day of accomplishments. But I'm going to still keep the strategic or the bigger projects in the buckets related to that. So let's say one of the projects having to do with the Daphne outreach we're going to be doing with schools. It's a bigger project ongoing. That certainly would always hold a space in that SWD bucket in the lower left-hand corner. I keep those on there as a reminder to get work done. Now, this is just kind of organizing as things come in from different channels and where to distribute them and put them on the sheet. But the how you get it done throughout the day then is, I think, where we also have some different ways that we do it. I'm in the camp of certainly blocking time and trying to get more of the strategic things done when I carve out the time for them on my schedule, for example. So this is the time I'm going to work on this part, this piece, and this is the time I'm going to work on that piece.
It's interesting because I've heard other people talk about, and particularly in trying to get into flow states, of knowing that, that they're more creative in the morning, or that they'll have less distractions in the evening, and really being mindful about organizing their work so that what they need to work on really aligns with where they are, either headspace or environment-wise. And I've fully never done that. Sometimes I'll block off time, but that's just to make sure I've literally got the time to be able to do it. So for example, I know I need to record a couple of videos on particular things coming up. So I found a block in my schedule where I know I will be ready to be on camera and can block out that time. But it never occurred to me I've never tried employing really aligning how I don't know, how my mood or my mind is at different points of the day to types of work. Do you do that?
No. I mean, I know there's books on flow time and figuring out how you work. I think the advice I often would give for people struggling with how do I get things done is to figure out what makes the most sense for you. There's certain principles that work, like bulking things together, trying to get tactical things done when you have
limited time,
and finding out ways in which you can make sure that the bigger things are going to be things you can do when you're uninterrupted. Your book writing habits, I think, fall into that camp where you know when you might have chunks of time and then you close the door, you remain uninterrupted in the best way you can. But I try to do things where I put a lot of my meetings that I have, advisory meetings, I try to put those on one day. So I just know that's going to be a day. I think you do that also with one-on-ones.
Yeah, you taught me that actually, the back-to-back and really trying to not let there be time in between or not much time in between. So you literally are going from one to the next. So it's a sprint, but then you've got time on either side of that to be able to catch up on the things that happen in the meantime. One of the things that you harp on quite a lot is, which I think really goes into this idea of getting things done and how do you do that, particularly at scale, is automating repetitive tasks. And so it's so interesting to me that you still write down everything every day and that you've not automated some of that list, particularly now that you're on the Remarkable.
Well, I made the Remarkable have a template so that I wouldn't have to rewrite the categories, the today, week, SWD, coal, advisory, et cetera. So that is a little bit automated. But I think there is something very tactile when it comes to writing and a frustration that happens if you're writing the same thing over and over again that you can't necessarily get with automation. But I definitely agree, and there's many experts out there talking about the ways to outsource things that are repetitive, or you can record a short video and show someone how to do that if you have somebody on your team who could be handling that. So I certainly think that there's a benefit in outsourcing repetitive tasks.
I was talking less about outsourcing and more about automating. So you do a lot to set up systems for us.
Yeah, I've set up a lot of systems that make sure different disparate platforms can talk to each other, whether it's Google Calendar. We use Zapier for many, many things to be able to connect and automate. And that certainly saves a lot of time. But looking at what are the things I spend the most time doing, what are the things that are repetitive, and this is something you certainly learn at Google, is thinking at scale, is if we're going to do this interview process for this many candidates, what does that look like if we're going to do it this many candidates time 100? And how can we make it more efficient? How can we make templates repeatable? How can we make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we do something? And it's amazing how much more efficient you can get if you start to look at, if I had to do this over and over again 100 times this week, what could I do to make it more efficient? And it will drive different behaviors, and it'll inspire you hopefully to find ways to leverage technology or other tools to become more efficient.
Well, and this is where I think pausing after you've rewritten the list and looking at it and reflecting on where could things be made to be more efficient, even when it takes more time and maybe thought in the near term in order to get that efficiency gain long term. It's funny because we have, or ironic maybe, it feels like we have more going on in a lot of different spaces relative to any time before. I mean, on the kid front, the family front, all their activities, but on the work front as well, where we're doing a lot more in a lot of different areas compared to where we were a decade ago, for example. But I don't feel more busy. And I think it's because of the way that we've looked at things and set things up so that systems talk to each other, or, we have a CRM set up that takes a lot of what could have been gross data work historically and makes that all really easy.
And it's important to make sure that, as I think the one sheet does for me, is to not lose sight of what are the important things that need to get done so that you never are dropping the ball on something or things aren't slipping through the cracks because you forgot them. If you have this one repository where things go, I need to make sure I do that, whether that's with a Post-it or you have some sort of framework for putting something, you don't end up dropping balls and you can continue to get done the things that need to get done. Do
you think someone can be successful and effective without that?
I've never seen it. Whether it's a company or an individual, I've never seen a successful individual or company that doesn't have a framework that involves some sort of ritual and routine for making sure that they're not dropping the ball and missing things. I mean, we've done it maybe not as diligently as we want to or should, but even the idea of, and we did an episode on OKRs and having OKRs as a couple of what are the things this quarter we want to do to make sure that we're taking care of each other and that we're making sure that we're taking care of the family. And it can be as boring of, oh, we need to schedule that orthodontist appointment, or we really need to make sure we go out on a date. And one might counter and say you shouldn't have to do that kind of stuff. But I think when you're juggling so many things, if you don't write it down, review it, keep it at top of mind, then these things don't get done.
I think for me, the real win out of the OKR process, so that's objectives and key results. It's the way quarterly goal setting is done at Google that we've done since then. There's actually an episode, I believe it's episode 13 of the Storytelling with Data podcast, Goals with Google, if anyone wants to listen more about that. But for me, the key component is you don't only set your objectives at the beginning of the time period, the quarter, for example, but at the end of that period, you go back and you reflect on them and grade them. And it's such a way of holding yourself and those around you accountable to what you said you were going to do. And so it can just put a different level of emphasis on, we know it's important to go out to dinner by ourselves every once in a while, but there's something about having it as an objective where you feel almost like you are allowed to in a different way.
Have you seen any new tools or utilized AI in a way that's helped you with any of the things that you've done historically, either manual or from a task planning or optimizing for time?
I find that ChatGPT for me has become a nice brainstorming partner for the things that give me pause and just where I kind of don't want to do it or I can't figure out the words right away. So like the email request to present to such and such group that I know I don't want to do, but I'm struggling with the words to do that I like using AI as a brainstorming partner there to say, and it knows who I am, right? It has all my books and knows my style. And so it's nice to be able to say, here's the scenario, here's what I want to say, but help me say it so that this feeling comes across, or it's an apologetic, or it's thoughtful, and just getting a draft to be able to start with and go from there. So I use it for drafting help with communications and with marketing language. It can be helpful.
Yeah, that's been a huge time saver for me as well. I found it really useful if I can actually direct it to do some of these scheduling tasks. So
I haven't had luck with that. It looks like it works, and then I look closer and it didn't really do what I asked or thought it was doing. Maybe I'm not using it right.
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was the boys were doing a swim meet, had all these different events. It was on 13 pages of heat sheets. I actually uploaded the PDF and I said, organize the schedule so I know when they're going to be swimming. And it saved me probably 30, 40 minutes of doing that.
You just have to be careful, though, because I did a similar thing in theory where I asked it to tell me all of the titles of the podcasts. We're doing a revamp of the page, and it was fully making up names on some of them.
You have to trust but verify.
Yeah.
I think that's important. I think making GPTs for things is going to be something that as people get more savvy with the different tools out there, it can be really helpful. For example, I've been really diligent on tracking if the kids they get sick or maybe they saw the doctor. And so creating a health GPT where we can put this information in one location and then reference it and go back to it as we need it. So you're not dealing with a file drawer of maybe you're keeping your notes and such, but instead you can say, when was that last time that he had this cough? Or
are there any privacy concerns with that, or does it?
Probably. We should probably look in and read the privacy concerns. Okay. But I try to keep out specific names and details, but use it in a way to at least contain all of your information in one bucket and then be able to draw upon it at some other date so you're not having to remember and retain all that information. Or even if you give really specific instructions around, I have this many minutes to do this task, which I've been putting off for too long, create a schedule for me in 5-minute blocks and hold me accountable to this by
Have you used it like that?
Sure enough. The better you are at giving directions and instructions, as if you had somebody working with you and you were really directing them to make sure that they could.
Yeah, you need to micromanage.
You would do that in a chat without offending them.
Yeah. Although I notice I still say like please and thank you.
I've heard that if you say please and thank you, you get different results.
Saying no is another way that I think we do well in managing everything going on.
That's like your default starting point is no. So I think that's worked really well for you. There is a funny, it's well known within the team that it starts with no is your default position.
Yeah, I've noticed people have started correcting for that or changing how they approach things. Amy, for example, she'll start a new idea off by saying something like, "So I know you're not going to like this, but hear me out," or something where she takes that away in the get-go, which I found I am strangely more likely to be accepting of what she says after that.
Yeah, I think it served you well to start from a position of no because you have a really clear vision of what you want. But sometimes we can miss other opportunities to do things, explore things, new ideas and perspectives. So I feel like with having a bigger team come a long way in terms of not being as fiercely no as you
But
might
I
be.
do think over time, it has been the aggressive prioritization. For me, it really was having kids and starting a family. And so that was right around the same time that I was starting to write the first book and that the company was really growing. That gave me a lot of reasons to say no to things that I would have probably historically said yes to. Because I think back to my days at Google, I just took on everything. I don't think I had that no response. I think I developed that as a survival mechanism.
It's funny with like the weekend kid birthday parties, though, you're not as no-centric. And I wish just for scheduling purposes and running the kids around that we would start with no on that. So we talked a lot about different techniques and methodologies and some of our best practices and starting with no, your default. Where does the family piece fit in or what's worked well for us? We talked a little bit about us having OKRs with each other, but juggling 3 kids, fortunately all in the same school.
Yeah, all in the same school. Well, they're all swimming at the same place. So I think some of it's been the intentional, like as the third comes along, like, Eloise, no, you really don't want to do gymnastics, right? You want to swim like your brothers so you can go there. And also I think the realization when we were probably a year or two in before we realized that we could drop them all off at the start of the first one's swim time and pick them all up at the end and they can take homework and do things there. So we've gotten more efficient, I think, in managing.
I think we've sought efficiencies in terms of, I know there's interest in doing other things and maybe we're bad parents because we're steering away from some things.
No, but we have done, right? The boys did soccer because they wanted to and you were griping the whole time, but yes. I ran them to different events and I actually really treasured especially Avery in the car. And I've heard this, that there's something about when you're facing forward so you're not looking at each other that it can help kids be really open. Like we've had some amazing conversations driving an hour to his soccer game. So I actually really enjoyed that. And then he'd always fall asleep on the way back so I could listen to a podcast or do something else. So it was like regained time for me.
We definitely look for efficiencies in where they're doing things, what they're doing. And also we've leveraged people who drive the kids around or take them to different activities. That's been super helpful. What else has been helpful?
I mean, Google Calendar, I think, is a simple thing that's been really helpful. We use the Google Suite at work, and so I've got my work calendar, your work calendar, but then our family calendar that we can overlay. And
don't forget, I bought that 22-inch Android giant touchpad.
Yeah, I'm not going to come around on that one.
It works great. You can see it. They see the schedule everywhere. It works really well.
One of my tactics is to start looking ahead. We're midweek now as we record this, but I've already looked out at next week to see where there are overlaps or scheduling challenges so that we can resolve those ahead of time before they become issues. So I think that's helpful, just having line of sight to what's coming.
I think it's been helpful for the kids to see how we work, not only from a standpoint of that we have the benefit of being able to do things from home while they're here. So if a kid comes home sick, we don't have to disrupt the workflow necessarily, and they see that. And then I also think it's been helpful for them in terms of learning skills to be able to manage and prioritize their own schedule. I don't know if you've seen any of what you do in
I know
any
you
of the
had
kids.
You had the kids setting OKRs.
Yeah, that was over summer vacation. I always talk to them about how summer's going to go really fast, and I know it's great to just take some time and relax, but what are some of the things that you would actually want to make sure that at the end of this long break that you've done, and what are those? And you can introduce these concepts pretty easily and in a very low-tech, not complicated way, like get out a sheet of paper. If you think about it's almost time to start school, what are the things that you will be happy when you say, I'm so glad that I blank over summer vacation? And I remember one of them was around swimming, that He wanted to be able to swim at a certain time.
I think Avery wanted to do so many pull-ups or something,
Yeah,
right?
that was pull-up. There was a lot of physical activity.
I always find it fascinating, too, because we did this. So over winter break, I drew out just a rudimentary grid of the days of the week for them because I wanted to get them to track a few things for us to be able to graph and do some things with when it came to things like how much they slept or how much screen time in a day. And then they picked a couple of things that they wanted to track. And we know this, but it's fascinating to see it play out, that as soon as you start tracking something, you become aware of it and you do more of it. And so Eloise wanted to track how much time she played with the dog. And so because she knew she had this box to fill out of how much time she played with the dog, like she was going on long walks with the dog. They were playing in the snow. They were doing all these things outside. Or Dorian was similar with his reading.
In teaching them these different techniques, if it's not front of center, then it may not exist. So with that OKR we did over the summer, I remember they both had their papers to their bedroom walls where they could see them and be reminded, otherwise you're going to. And that's not so different than having that one sheet that you look at and say, I need to get this thing done. I need to work on this.
Although actually on the one sheet, that makes me recall last year when Avery started middle school and you tried to get him to do your one sheet, and it turned into this big fiasco because he wanted to then do the one sheet, which was different from what they were trying to teach him in the planner. And so he actually didn't do either of them consistently. I don't think we might have screwed
That's
that one
where
up.
it's, I think schools have to find flexibility and figuring out, just as every individual does, is what works for you is what you should invest the time in. So a school to say, this is the way to track things. I understand they're trying to introduce a methodology for students to start doing. But if a student comes and has their own system for staying on top of things, I think you should let them go with it.
We might disagree on this one.
If we look back, especially during COVID, when many companies went to a remote workforce, people worked from home, students tried to study from home, and this was the new normal, which people got very comfortable with. And I remember saying at the time, because companies like Google also had gone distributed. And I remember saying these companies have spent billions of dollars on
office space.
And not just that, because part of their culture is collaboration happens from impromptu conversations while playing foosball or grabbing a coffee. And so this is part of their culture, and it's not going to work. Either the company doesn't succeed or they shift back to saying you need to come in office. And I think we're seeing that across both public and private sector where people are needing to come back into the office, which I personally think is a very good thing. Might be controversial, but I think it's a very good thing.
I think it's a good thing also.
What do you think? Are most people cut out to work from home?
I don't know about being cut out or not, but I know that there's a different type of work that happens when people are together in person. Different ideas come out of that. That's one of the things. So storytelling with data has always been a remote environment, which has worked for us and will continue to work for us, maybe partly because it was first me working from home. And as you talked about in the lead-in, I can focus. That I don't know what makes it like that, but I can get into something. I'm completely self-propelled. I don't need outside pressure or accountability to get stuff done.
And you can't forget that we also hired for people who could work in this way.
Well, that was untested, though. I mean, we hired people, knowing that would be the work environment, but not necessarily knowing going in whether that would be.
I think a lot of the questions that I had focused on when we interviewed were.
Well, because that was one of our biggest concerns of can we hire for this? And particularly because everybody we hired came from working at a company in office.
Right. And if you think about the majority of the work that the team is doing is in person with our clients. They're going to the client, they're doing a workshop, they're feeding off of that, they're getting ideas, it's happening there. And then we do things specifically to make sure every opportunity we can to come together.
Get people together. Well, and we decided we had a little bit of back and forth because we have some things coming up in London, including a conference and a masterclass there. We'd originally thought, let's get everybody together. And I was like, oh, it's coming up fast. We're busy. But then I've come back around to, no, we need to get everybody together in person because of the strategic conversations that we can have in person that aren't. They're not the same otherwise. You don't get to the same, there's not the same candor. There's not the same just free-flowing conversation when everybody's a box on a screen.
Right. I do think that people
there are
have
different sorts of things that I think are worth getting done in person versus trying to do remotely or virtually.
That's a better way of saying it.
I think it's more about whether people need external accountability, because a work environment does that. There are other people to see if you're at your desk doing things, other people to meet with for this sort of not only to look productive, but to actually be productive. I think probably some people need that external.
It's part of how we evolved as humans. We saw what the other people were doing in the early development of humans, of working and gathering food. And if you were going to be the person who's going to participate in eating the food, you weren't going to just sit back. You were going to go also and do that. So I think there's that.
Yeah, evolutionary.
I think people can be productive, but I do feel your point about other things of great benefit come out from being together and working with each other.
Well, and I think when it comes back to what we've been talking about today of getting things done and how do you do it and when do you do it, that where do you do it becomes another piece of that. And really thinking about when should you be in person with somebody for a certain conversation or to get a certain type of project done because that's going to be more efficient and you're going to be battling, or it's going to take a lot longer if you are emailing things back and forth. It's going to be a lot of back and forth versus sitting in person and talking with someone and getting things resolved immediately. I think one of the interesting things is how, everything changes. I guess that's a constant of life. But because I think of even our comments on a kid coming home sick doesn't interrupt the day. Like it certainly used to when they were toddlers and you needed to be more on than we do now. So it's a different season from...
I think the stages of life certainly play into, there'll be times when you just know this is one of those stages where I'm not going to be able to have the time that I need to do the things that I want to do.
It does make me nervous, though, because I feel like we're in a stage right now where we've kind of, quote unquote, figured it out. Like things seem relatively smooth right now, which always makes me very nervous because it means something's about to shift.
Right.
But I guess that's part of it is we've learned how to be flexible.
I think knowing that things are going to change is important. Knowing that a kid coming home sick 3-4 years ago is very different than today. And so I think there's going to be different stages when these changes will disrupt your flow and what you get done and the expectations that you have on yourself for getting things done.
Well, and I think one lesson that I have learned and am still not totally comfortable with, but have gotten more comfortable with the idea, is I used to be somebody who would check everything off their list, like not on a daily basis, but eventually I would get everything done and just realizing...
Like inbox zero?
No, not my inbox. But I would have a list and I would get everything on the list done over some period of time. And I've grown comfortable with the idea that the list will always be bigger than the amount of time there is. And it's okay to not get it all done. And I'm going to choose and prioritize fiercely to get the things done that I care about and let go of some of the rest.
That's very similar advice I remember giving to someone who used to work for me who was promoted into a really senior role. And I said, one of the things you're going to realize is that you can't get it all done like you used to.
Yeah.
And it will all be about knowing that, one, you won't get everything done, but two, your job now in this new role is to prioritize the things that are most important to get done.
And I don't think you have to be in a senior position for that to hold true. I think
agree.
That's one of those things that anyone can look at their list and decide which are the critical things. Where do you devote your time and attention and energy, and which things do you let go of?
Speaking of critical things to get done, I just looked at the clock. I need to go get the kids. Seems like a good place to wrap. Thanks. I hope this was helpful for folks, and let's try to do more of it.
See you next time. Thanks for listening.